Alright, so welcome back. Social 30. Today's lesson, lesson 6, responses to the Industrial Revolution and classic economic liberalism, aka capitalism, is our look at chapter 4. And by the end of today's class, you should be able to not only recognize the issues that they had with classic economic liberalism, aka capitalism, and the need for some kind of reform, but you should be able to look at a number of ideologies and say, okay, this is a group, the Luddites, the Chartists, the Socialists, the Marxists, this is the issue that they saw, and this is their solution they wanted. Now this is important because economics is 45% of the year, and a very standard way of testing you on economics is to give you some multiple choice and ask you to find a perspective. So the answer could be Luddites, could be socialist, could be communist, could be Chartists, could be Robert Owen, could be other things. Or we'll ask you to use an ideology and then somehow synthetically apply it. So definitely the content today is one of those important building block days in economics. I'm going to give you an overview to begin with, and then we're going to look a little deeper into these ideologies. So logically, the first ideology we need to talk about is the one that the other ones are responding to. So before we can get into socialism and Marxism and Luddites and Chartists, we should really talk about capitalism. So we will watch a video on Adam Smith, and we'll be able to unpack his ideology a little bit more with the video. But I'd like to just kind of introduce things to begin with here a little bit. And the key introduction to capitalism for me would be the idea of self-interest. Self-interest. That's how it fits in with liberalism. That's how capitalism fits in with individualism. That the primary driver of the economy should be self-interest. That each one of you works in your own self-interest, then the government's role in the economy can be minimized. See, Adam Smith's idea of laissez-faire capitalism was really an antithesis, an antithesis of mercantilism. So under mercantilism, the government gets their hands involved in the economy. They shape the economy by granting royal monopolies to certain corporations. And Adam Smith observed that because of that practice, the wealth of the nation was being limited. So how do you unlock the true potential of the nation? Fits in with the essay you're writing. How do you unlock the full potential of the nation? To him, it was through individualism, through self-interest. And there's lots of great quotes that fit in with this. There's one that we've seen on the diploma before, and I think I've made some multiple choice questions of my own based on it. So Adam Smith said, "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages." So what he's getting at here in the Wealth of Nations is that the driver of economics, the motivator of human activity, is self-interest. That the majority of us get jobs not to serve the community, but to serve ourselves. But Adam Smith believed that by serving ourselves, we could serve the community. And that's the invisible hand. The idea that our invisible hand of self-interest will have a benefit to others. So because the butcher, the brewer, and the baker all have their own self-interest, you get breakfast in the morning. Because the butcher wants to have a good life, you can have the wares that the butcher creates. Some cut meats and things like that. Because the brewer has, a desire for a good life. The baker has a desire for a good life. because the baker wants to have a good life. The baker has to provide something to the marketplace of value, and therefore you get the bread you want, you get the buns you want. So we don't need government here. We don't need government regulating and answering the three basic economic questions: what to produce, how to produce it, and who to give it to. Adam Smith says the government needs to take a hands-off approach to the economy and allow our human nature to direct the economy. And by nature, we are rational and self-interested. If we can unlock that self-interest, the economy will grow much larger. So that's the essence of capitalism. That is the essence of capitalism. Now, because his goal was to have a market that was free, there is some role of government here, and the main one that we talk about is there should be no monopolies in the marketplace. The market's not free if one person has a monopoly, because if there's only one person selling water bottles, you guys seem to like water bottles, if there's only one company that sells them, then they can set the price artificially high because there's no competition. So there is a role for government in Adam Smith's economy, but it's to ensure the freedom of the marketplace by breaking up monopolies and by creating legislation that protects private property. Because if there's no legislation protecting private property, then I'm just simply going to come take whatever I want. Because your private property is now mine. Because there's no police, there's no laws. So those are nice headphones. Suddenly they're mine. I could use another car. I'll take yours. And you're like, no, there should be legislation. One of the roles of government is to protect private property, because if the government doesn't protect private property, it takes away a lot of the incentive to work. If you know whatever you do accumulate will just be plundered. So that, in a nutshell, is Adam Smith. Now, there's going to be lots of reactions to the Industrial Revolution. One of the reactions is that of the Luddites, sometimes pronounced Luddites. So we're going to be looking at these guys today. They had as a leader a guy named Neil Ludd. And Luddites, put simply, are people that look at the sudden mechanization of labor. People are using machines now to replace the work of people. And they're like, we don't like this. We don't like people being replaced by machines. So they attack the factories and they smash the machines with axes and things like that. When we talk about the word reactionary, the ideological grouping that are reactionaries, Luddites are reactionaries. They're like, we're going to use violence to try to undo this progressive change. We're going to use violence to try to take the economy back and de-mechanize it. Get rid of all these machines. So what is the problem that the Luddites saw? Machines were replacing people. That workers' value was being replaced by machines. And because of that, the workers were living in poverty. Their solution, let's use violence to destroy the machines. So for each one of these ideologies, we want to be able to put briefly, what is their issue? What was their solution? And if you can figure that out, then you can figure out the multiple choice questions attached to them. We have another group that we're going to see today, and that's the Chartists. The Chartists, like the Luddites, looked into the Industrial Revolution, looked into capitalism, and saw some flaws. There are flaws here because mankind is flawed. They saw flaws because individualism is flawed. They saw flaws because self-interest, the building block, the cornerstone, grade 10 cornerstones, the cornerstone of capitalism, self-interest, they found would poison society. It led to exploitation. So the solution for Chartists was through government. Not modern liberalism, that's the 20th century, but they figured that if the right to vote, if the franchise was extended beyond just the elite, then the government would become the voice of more than just the wealthy. So how do you get a government that becomes the voice of the workers? Well, you have to give the workers the right to vote. So for Chartists, they saw their solution with democracy. So the problem they saw was people were being exploited. Their solution was democracy. That the government would protect the workers if the government had to serve their will. And the government will have to serve their will if we give them the right to vote. Pretty simple. So when we look at some of the reforms in England in the 19th century, including much of the Factory Acts, that's with the spirit of Chartists. They believed that reform could happen within the system. So they're not revolutionaries, because they believe that within the system there's opportunity to fix the system. Now we have a guy named Robert Owen. The textbook does a good job with Robert Owen. So definitely some pages in chapter 4 that you need to read over. Robert Owen comes up on the multiple choice from time to time, but he comes up on a lot of essays. A lot of students write a Goldilocks essay, and they end up arguing in favor of Robert Owen in the end. So Goldilocks essay is like, this is what too little government in the economy looks like. Capitalism gone bad, exploitation, environmental degrading and all this stuff. And then this is too much government in the economy. The Soviet Union, North Korea, the idea of the stagnation, no incentive. And then they say, well, now we need a mix of some sort where the government is fulfilling some of the necessary roles. And then they're like, well, Robert Owen tried this back in the 19th century. If you're going to be writing about Robert Owen in an essay, you really need to know some specifics to get to a PF, right? So let's talk about Robert Owen for a second. And again, there's a video we'll get to. This is just the intro. Robert Owen, he's a capitalist by occupation. So that's something I want to make clear. He owns the factory. He's a factory owner. So by profession, he's a capitalist. But by ideology, he's a socialist. So he's a rare breed. He's a rare breed because most capitalists, they run the factory to maximize profit, to serve their needs. So if Robert Owen was a typical capitalist, he should be trying to make as much money out of his workers as possible so that Robert Owen can get as rich as possible. And if some of his workers get maimed in the process or die, so be it. Because the ends justify the means, and the ends to a capitalist is profit. But Robert Owen was different. He had empathy and compassion for his workers. So when we look at Canada today, we look at many roles that the Canadian government plays in the economy. When we look back to Robert Owen in the 19th century, he was playing those roles in his town, New Lanark, Scotland. So in New Lanark in Scotland, he became the government, the de facto government, right? The de facto authority. So he became the de facto government in his factory town because there wasn't legislation in place to protect his workers, so he created it. He's like, you know what? We're not going to allow kids to work in my factory. No kids. Kids are not going to work here. We're going to provide school for them instead. So today in Canada, the government provides school. But in Robert Owen's Scotland, the government was not providing public education. So he said, you know what? I'm going to be the change I want to see for the world. So he provided public education for his children of his town. He provided them leisure activity. So he made parks and recreation. And the children didn't have to work because he paid the workers more than typically they would make in other factories. So rather than having your kids work, he just paid mom and dad more. So the kids didn't have to work. Kids could go to school, they could play. A lot of his fellow capitalists, they would be gouging their workers not only by paying them low wages, but they'd gouge them by charging them high prices at the factory store. So typically these towns have very few stores, and they're owned by the guy who owns the factory. So he's going to pay you very little, and he's going to charge you lots for stuff. So then you become like a pseudo slave to him. He's going to keep prices affordable at the store. He's going to pay them wages higher than market value. He's going to educate their kids. He's going to provide them affordable housing, affordable commodities at the store. He's giving them rec and leisure activities. This is an ideological revolution. It's not a revolution in the sense that people will have to use violence to achieve it, but it is a revolution of thinking that the factory owner could still make a profit and serve the needs of his workers at the same time. And this is why when we think of Robert Owen, we think of collectivism, because it's not just self-interest, he's thinking of the common good. What benefits the community? How can we cooperate to create a better community? He felt a responsibility to others, a collective responsibility. And he didn't wait for the government to tax him to be the change. He acted out of his own will. So, we'll see more about Owen in the textbook. There were some things the workers had to do back for him, like no public drunkenness. But he gave them like Sundays off and stuff like that. This is a revolution. It truly was. But Robert Owen is the exception. Most capitalists were not like Robert Owen. Most capitalists are practicing self-interest, and they do it to such an extreme that their workers were being maimed and just simply replaced. So most socialists felt that Robert Owen was an exception, and therefore they needed to come up with a new path to utopia, because the Robert Owens of the world were few. So in the mid-19th century, a socialist named Karl Marx was asked to come up with a new path to utopia. And after some factory tours, he went around and he visited the factories and talked to the workers. Karl Marx wrote Communist Manifesto, and he wrote Das Kapital. And in these works, he basically writes the essence of Marxism that we recognize as communism. Karl Marx is, along with Adam Smith, the two most important people in this economics unit. So, and it almost always happens. We teach you Locke and Hobbes at the beginning of the year, and then people try to use Locke and Hobbes all year long. It's like at the beginning of class we showed you, a hammer, and every problem you're like, let's use a hammer on this. That's like, well, actually this one's for a screwdriver. This is a discussion for Smith and Marx, not Locke and Hobbes. Whenever the issue is economic, look for Smith and Marx first. So, Karl Marx, and we really need to know communism quite well. He really talks about communism as going to be a part of many stages, and I'm about to outline them for you. And again, this is an introduction. When you go to university, if you study economics, if you study philosophy, you're going to see stuff in greater detail. But to Karl Marx, he believes history is a history of class struggle. So that's the beginning point for Marx. He looks around, he travels, he tours those factories, and he sees that history has always been a struggle between two groups. And in his time, the struggle was between the workers and the capitalists. The workers he calls the proletariat, and the capitalists are the bourgeoisie. So we have the workers against the proletariat. Sorry, the workers are the proletariat. The workers against the capitalists. We have the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. And he figured that at some point, the workers would have an epiphany, a moment of clarity, an awakening. And they would realize that they're being oppressed. And when they realized that they're being oppressed, they would be angry about that. And they would rise up and take over the factory. Now let's say in this scenario, I'm the factory owner, I'm the bourgeoisie, and you're the proletariat. Am I going to willingly give up my factory? No. You're going to have to fight. So, I know what you're thinking. There's no way that you guys could beat me in a fight. And you're right, this is a bad example. Because you guys could use weapons and violence and all that, and I'd still come out the victor. I'm basically, White Rock, right? A town in BC. But let's pretend for a moment I'm just a mortal man. I'm like the rest of you. So, if you have the advantage of numbers, if the workers have the advantage of numbers, and they grab weapons, they could take over the factory. That's plausible. And once they take over the factory, you guys take over this factory, you're going to inspire workers in other factories to follow suit, because they're going to also have an epiphany and say, wow, we're being exploited too. Maybe we should also use force and take over our factories. But the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, they're going to resist, so we're going to have civil war. So far we have history is a history of class struggle. We have workers have an epiphany. We have workers use violence to take over the factories. And then we have civil war steps. And I think that, if you do it like this, just do, and then you can visualize, maybe you can visualize me, making these steps in class, and it'll help you on a test if it's testing the steps. Now, once they have the Civil War, the workers will win the Civil War because they have the numbers, but because they also control the means of production. They control the factories. So we have a Civil War, the workers, the proletariat, they win the Civil War. Once they win the Civil War, they're going to have to create a government. And it will be a dictatorship of the proletariat, dictatorship of the workers. And the purpose of the government is to create a paradigm shift in the hearts and minds of the people. Social 10, paradigm shift. So we're going to create a paradigm shift in the hearts and minds of the people. We're going to fill their hearts with the maxim, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That we are going to change why they work and why they live. They don't live to serve themselves, they live to serve others. That's a paradigm shift. It's going to take some indoctrination. That's why we have a dictatorship of the workers. But once the indoctrination sets, then the state can wither away, and we arrive at utopia. That's Karl Marx. And you need to know the steps. So, in summary, history is a history of class struggle. Workers will have an epiphany that they're being exploited by the bourgeoisie. They'll use violence and take over the factory. They'll lead to a civil war, because the capitalists aren't going to want to give up their factories. The workers will win the Civil War because they have the means of production. Then they'll create a dictatorship of the proletariat. They'll want to create a paradigm shift where they install the maxim, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, which is a paradigm shift towards collectivism. Once the hearts and minds have been won, the state can wither away, and you have utopia. It's easy. Hi. Yeah. It's easy, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, it's just some steps. It's just some steps, right? And again, I look at a group of people that there's no reason why you cannot learn what I've learned. You know, you're for the most part brighter than I am. You have rich futures in front of you, and I'm not looking at any notes when I go through those because I've learned it, and you need to learn those steps too, because it is tested, and even if it's not tested, to some extent, we're still in that cycle of class warfare. We talk about the 99% and the 1%, and even though the word communism has become stigmatized by the Soviet Union, to some extent, people look at our future and are saying the only way we have a future is if we truly embrace communism. So communism is not on the trash heap of history. That communism is an ideology of the future, more so than it had been in the past. So it is an interesting thing to look at. So that's communism in a nutshell. Another term that comes up is robber barons. So chapter 4, we'll talk about this great gap between the rich and the poor, and the idea that classic economic liberalism, capitalism, is only benefiting the wealthy, the elite, and they call them robber barons because they're the new nobles. So one level of the nobility is a baron. The Baron of Sussex. So these are people that have become robber barons. They're barons because they robbed wealth from their workers. So the term robber baron is an attack at how capitalists have become wealthy. And we can see evidence of robber barons when you see the poverty workers live in at the turn of the 20th century. In places like New York, in the tenement lifestyle. But Milton Friedman's going to tell us that the robber baron idea is a myth. That it's an attack on capitalists, and it's not a fair attack. That capitalists are much more than robber barons. That they are serving their communities. So we'll be able to look at some sources and try to find some perspectives and say, okay, is this a perspective that is celebrating capitalism, or is it attacking capitalism? And what would a Chartist would say is the solution? What would a socialist say is the solution? What would a Marxist say is the solution? Do they need more or less government? We have some practice multiple choice in here. We have some quotes by Henry George, and that billboard, that's an attack on capitalism there. And chapter 4 also allows us to begin to talk about the progressive era. And I have a video I'm going to share with you on the progressive era that is going to teach well beyond anything you're going to get tested on. But as a consequence of the progressive era, we have presidents like President Teddy Roosevelt, who changes the relationship between the government and government in the United States. He begins to become the voice of workers as well as capitalists, as he creates legislation to protect his workers. Things like unemployment protection, and the progressive movement will also be championing protection for child labor, and ultimately votes for women. So we'll look at the progressive era here as well. Now, there were some capitalists, like Robert Owen, that were working on behalf of their workers. I would never say that Henry Ford's a socialist, but Henry Ford might fit under the term industrial paternalist. So, you're like, hey, industrial paternalism. I've seen that term before on our quiz last week. So, for industrial paternalists, they believe it should be the elite, but not government, but the elite that should care for their workers. So Henry Ford didn't want to be taxed by government and have the government care for his workers. Henry Ford thought, you know what, maybe I can care for my workers. So industrial paternalism, it's not the role of the state to see that the poor, the indigent, are paid a minimum wage. It is the duty of the employers. It is the duty of religious institutions. It's the duty of charities and you and I to create a society where the poor are taken care of, where the lower wage earners are paid what they are worth. And that's a quote by Henry Ford, a capitalist that was a titan of industry, was a pioneer, a visionary that helped build America, but he's also saying we don't need big government. We need church. We need local community groups. We need the capitalists in the community to pay the workers enough. So just because you're a capitalist doesn't mean that you're not going to be compassionate. But it does mean that you don't think it should be the government gets involved. And again, we can look at CERB, and we can look at the price of the Prime Minister Trudeau's intervention in the economy, $10,000 per Canadian. No Canadian got $10,000. So where did the rest of the money go? It went to the inefficient bureaucracy of government. Government's inefficient. Billions of dollars are lost. Globally, trillions of dollars are lost in the big mystery that is government. And sometimes it's lost because it's being stolen through corrupt politicians. So rather than inviting government to be the solution that we need in the economy, capitalists like Henry Ford, he's like, well, let's just pay our workers a little bit more. Let's let the churches, let's have them be a little more charitable. So that's an interesting idea. So Henry Ford helped to create the middle class in America. He's often credited with being the creator of the middle class. And he does this by paying his workers $5 a day. And you might be saying, well, what's the significance of that? $5 a day doesn't seem like a whole lot. I don't think I want to go back to the previous thing to show that. It's going to take a while. So what I wanted, I thought it was going to be a link to show us like relatively, $5 a day. How much is that compared to the average worker? I want to say it was more than double. We'll have to look that up. Also on September 25th, 1926, Ford Motor Company founder Henry Ford made a groundbreaking change by being one of the first companies to change his work policy to 40-hour weeks, 5 days a week, with no change in wages. So he's like, okay guys, we're not going to do 7 days a week. We're not going to do 12, 14 hours a day. We're going to do 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and I'm going to make sure you get paid the same as you're getting paid now. So you can work less and make the same. Henry Ford also realized that his workers were his consumers. Who's going to buy these cars? My workers are. So they're going to need to make a little bit more money. So Henry Ford helped build the middle class in America by recognizing the fact that he had a responsibility to his workers. He's not Robert Owen. He's not providing education. He's not providing rec and leisure and things like that. But he's also not the greedy robber baron that Karl Marx thought that capitalists were. And as long as there's men like Henry Ford, then maybe a communist revolution is not necessary. Maybe we can change the system from within rather than revolting and creating an entirely new system. But minimum wage remains a very controversial issue today because industrial paternalism is very rare. So we have ads like this: no $15, no peace. No $15, no lease. We have people in different jurisdictions demanding higher minimum wages. And one of the ways they end up trying to achieve that is through, once again, collective bargaining. What is collective bargaining? Unions. The power of the group of workers together. So we have lots of this. Now once again, this one really resonates with me. Is back at the turn of the 20th century, my ancestors didn't have the right to work in many places because people would have this sign of, no Irish need apply. We're not going to hire Irish, we're not going to hire Catholics. If you're Irish Catholic, we're not going to hire you. So definitely, I can understand what it means to be a product of marginalization. Then we have some assessment at the end, some A1 stuff that you've already seen that maybe makes a little bit more sense now. And then an essay. So that's the preview. We're going to go back now and look down the rabbit hole a little bit further at some of the videos. But that's kind of like the big picture summary of chapter 4. Before we go back and watch the video on Adam Smith, the video on the Luddites, any questions about the overview? So for each group, it's like, this is what we don't like about capitalism, this is our solution. Just like that. Looks like no questions, so I'm going to stop recording the video. I'm going to send this one to YouTube, and while it's being sent to YouTube, we're going to watch some of the other videos together.